Sex trafficking has been a topic more and more people are becoming aware of and are caring about. But what is sex trafficking, exploitation versus voluntary sex work? Not only are people confused, but so is law enforcement. With us now is Andrea Powell. Andrea first founded Fair Girls to support young women and girls who have survived human trafficking, which then went on to create the Vita Home, a safe home for young women survivors of human trafficking. Andrea then worked with survivors and advocates to create outreach programs and to advocates for justice for survivors. In 2019, Andrea founded Karina Rising to advocate for systemic change to ensure survivors of sex trafficking are not wrongfully arrested and incarcerated because of their own trafficking and abuse. She's now written a book about one such trafficked woman who was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The book is called Believe Me: The True Story of How a Trafficked Teen and Her Advocate Changed the Justice System and Found True Freedom. Andrea, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Kim, thank you so much for having me.
This is a subject that's really dear to my heart. I actually was involved in an organization to stop trafficking, to stop sex trafficking, and had done some work for the organization. It was called at the time Stop Sex Trafficking Now, Child Sex Trafficking Now. They've since changed their names, but people don't realize how bad of a problem sex trafficking actually is. I think they're just turning a blind eye to it. They're not seeing these victims. The victims often, it's not as obvious, I think, as other victims at times. And so it tends to go unnoticed. And people also kind of tend to think it's something that happens in other countries and not here. That was my experience working with people. Tell us about how you got into this.
So I was a teenager in Germany and I was studying abroad, and I started taking classes at what I thought was an English language center, but it was a domestic violence center. Language problem, I didn't know that. And I met a young lady who was a little older than me, but also a teenager who had been enslaved and basically, I think, sold by her parents to a man in his 60s, and she was one of his 4 wives. There was a tremendous amount of abuse, and she would come to class every day. And you ask someone like, what happened to your lip? What happened to your arm? Where's that bruise from? And it would always be transactional. I didn't fold the clothes right. I talked back. I tried to take a walk by myself, like things like this. And so when she disappeared, I knew that her family had relocated from the Middle East to Bosnia. So I went there ultimately sometime later to try to find her, or at least tell her family what I'd seen. And I did not find my friend. I've never found my friend, but I walked smack into brothels and smack into sex trafficking. But that, I didn't know what that meant. I just had a little folder in my notebook that said "people buying people?" ? And that was my entree into the issue.
And so you're saying, so you met her when you were living in Germany in a foreign exchange program?
Yeah, exactly. And I went to the police, and they just wouldn't. The police just wouldn't react. They were like, "You're foreign, she's foreign. What do we care?" It was horrible, and I had no evidence of anything. And I just felt like I failed her, and that sat with me for a long time.
And you said you went looking for her. Where did you go? Was it in Germany or somewhere else?
Sarajevo, Bosnia. So keep in mind, this was not long after the war. And so the stories I would hear from everybody of the trafficking, of the abuse, not just by, scary Middle Eastern men, as people like to put in the movies, but by UN soldiers, US people. I mean, it was everywhere. And I was honestly so terrified as a very young woman at that time that I vowed to help her, but I didn't know for years what that actually would mean in my life. Yeah.
How incredible for you to have traveled there trying to find her, tracking her down. I mean, I don't even know where you would begin with trying to, I guess you had some basic information of her name or.
I knew she was Middle Eastern and her dad had been a professor. And I'm from a small Texas town. So my thought process was, how hard could that be? I'll just walk around asking everybody, where's that Middle Eastern professor? As it turns out, that was not easy. And her name, which I changed in my book I just released, is a very, very common Middle Eastern name. And so was her last name. So it was like looking for Jenny Smith.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so this got you involved. At that point, you realized there's a problem out there. You want to help and fix it. What happened after that?
So after that, I ultimately went on to graduate school in Germany, moved to Boston, and started a nonprofit called Fair Girls. And our goal was, quite honestly, for me to go back to Bosnia and help pass laws and try to fight for girls over there who were experiencing exploitation and trafficking. Fast forward 2006, 2007, I was convinced by some US colleagues to go into a DC public school where I was living at the time to talk to kids about trafficking. Kim, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I walked out with two teenage girls as my clients. I had no office. I just brought them home with me. The police were like, this is not our business. This isn't child abuse. And one of the girls subsequently was arrested for prostitution. She was 14. There was even media about her as a child prostitute. And it just hit me like a brick. This isn't Bosnia. This isn't Russia. This isn't Mexico. This is the nation's capital. And
Yeah.
girls are just being treated like criminals or completely vanishing. And I just knew that that was my life calling, that I had to do something with them and to support them.
So when you say that these girls, you started this in DC, you went. I'm just trying to put these pieces together a little bit in my mind. So you started an organization, Fair Girls. You went to go speak at, you said, a high school,
A
and
local high school. Mhm.
and while you were there speaking, two girls came up to you and said, "This might be me."
Yeah, they both came up to me and said that they had a family member who was selling them out of their house. And they had never thought of themselves as a victim of anything. They just thought, that's just how it's going to be in my life. And when they heard the stories of other girls, I was talking about my friend, I was talking about other girls I met in Bosnia and Serbia, they saw themselves in it. But there was really no protection at that time. There was no law against sex trafficking or human trafficking in DC. There was no shelter that was really equipped to protect them. And because it was a family member, it would be considered child abuse, but not necessarily trafficking. So that turned into an idea that myself and my one employee had to go into DC schools and talk to kids about trafficking. And in the first year, we talked to 1,000 kids in classes across the city, and 80% raised their hand when we asked if they knew another child who had experienced trafficking or exploitation.
Oh, geez. So your book,
Just
Believe Me, is the story of, is it one of these girls that you came across in DC, or is this someone else?
So actually, we started to notice a trend that most of the girls, over a period of time, we started to notice they were being sold online. First, it was Craigslist, then it was a website called Backpage.com. And we
Uh-huh.
started and got very involved in an advocacy campaign to shut Backpage down. And I mean, this is a $40 million business, and we were just a staff of two. You could have just closed the closet door and been done with us. But we got a lot of national attention. And along the way, it was a USA Today article that happened to go into prisons, and a young teenage girl's dad saw the article, sent it to his daughter, who had been sentenced to 30 years in prison as a result of being a victim of child sex trafficking. And she asked me one question: am I a victim of child sex trafficking, or am I a prostitute? And I wrote her back that night when I got the letter, 20-page letter explaining the law. And I called the sheriff's office the next day, and the response was, that's what she gets for shacking up with a black pen. And I thought I could get her out in a year. And Kim, it took over 10 years in advocating and actually changing the laws in the state of Georgia that we then used to help get this young lady, Tiffany, out. And she got out in November 2022. But we both know that we're far from over in fighting this. But she is the crux of the story of what happens when you don't believe someone, when you don't
Yeah.
help a victim.
And she was sentenced to 30 years for what?
Her trafficker, who was double her age, she was 17, he had used her phone to lure another 14-year-old runaway,
Uh-huh.
and thought he had threatened both. Tiffany had been stabbed in the leg. She was 8 months pregnant. She was really unable to leave that situation at all. She was terrified. And when this young girl when he let her go, he thought she would keep her mouth shut, but she didn't. And she fought back. And so when the police came to arrest the trafficker, they also arrested Tiffany.
Mhm.
And she had a public defender whose best defense was, she's damaged goods.
And so often these girls, when you think about a young girl that gets trafficked into this terrible situation, the trafficker then turns the girl into a trafficker, right? He uses her as a bait lure for other girls to get them in.
Yeah,
And so the victimization goes, and then that girl is then treated like she's the criminal when she's been trafficked the entire time and forced to engage in more trafficking, but it's still victimization. I mean, she's still being victimized, forced
exactly.
into these situations.
Exactly.
Um,
And often there's so many threats, there's so many things that the public eye wouldn't see that she's experiencing. That's coupled with the fact that they see that girls like them get arrested. So they don't think anyone's coming to help them.
right. What an awful situation. Are the laws better now?
The laws are certainly better. So the law that we advocated for in the state of Georgia, which is now a very progressive law, is called vacatur. So because she's a victim of trafficking, she is not culpable for the things that happened as a result of that trafficking. And so
Mhm.
she was able to get her record expunged, basically. In her
After
case,
10
not fully.
years of serving, that was 10 years, but you can't get
10
your
years.
10 years back.
You can't get your 10 years back. And, so we spent, all that time on the phone, video calls. We made an advocacy film. Mira Sovino, the actor, got involved. It was way more than I ever expected. When I promised Tiffany I'd help her get out, I really had no idea what I was committing to. But along the way, I started to see that we need these vacatur laws on a national level, on a state level. We also need to hold traffickers more accountable for what they're doing when they do something like make another girl complicit in the crime, because that sets them up for a lifetime of abuse, getting on the sex offender registry, not being able to get housing, not being able to go to college. You're basically boxing them out of society.
Yeah.
And in Tiffany's case, 10 years is better than 30 years, but it's still, that's her whole 20s are erased.
Yeah. Uh, I think one of the issues is society, right? Society's thinking on this. So they see a girl that's a prostitute and they think, well, you're dirty, you're bad, you're the bad one. You made these bad life choices. It's your fault. Do you see a shift in the attitude when it just comes to society on that in their approach? Because I think that's what then created the laws where the prostitutes end up in jail. They've criminalized it. They've made it, instead of going after the men that are pimping them out or trafficking them or even the Johns, they go after the girls. And I mean, are you seeing a shift in that perception?
I'm seeing a shift, but I'm also seeing that trafficking is more and more happening online through deep fake abuse, through sextortion, through things that are still very victim blaming, where people are thinking, oh, it's not that big a deal. She can get out if she really wanted to. But I think we need to shift the narrative, and we're starting to not what was she doing? Why didn't she leave? But why did he walk in the room and close the door and rape her?
Mhm.
And why did he lure her out of that school or out of that bus? Or, I think we need to ask different questions in order to have better laws and have them better enforced. Because when Tiffany was arrested in Georgia, children could not be arrested for prostitution, and yet she was arrested for being a trafficker. Like it was in that case a matter of the law not being rightly applied, and I think that's what's
Mhm.
still happening on a mass scale. And that's where I think survivors, and what compelled me to write this book, survivors are so critical in helping people understand what really happens.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one thing when I was working with Stop Child Sex Trafficking now was that the stories I would interview the people who were trafficked and their stories. I mean, there was one girl who was trafficked right underneath her parents' noses. They had no idea that she was being forced to sneak out of her bedroom at night as a teenager to go and perform sex acts for men because she was basically being she was young, 15, 14, 15 when they lured her in, and she believed that they would hurt her or her family members or that they would shame her, and they had photographs of her that they would then share with her dad, to make her feel so she felt like in order to hide this secret she had to keep, they use all these manipulation psychology tactics. And it's not, when people imagine being enslaved in trafficking, I think that they think of, well, you're chained somewhere, you're not free to go, right? But there's so many other ways to trap a person and to make the person feel like they have no choice.
Exactly. And the thing is, if you're a 14, 15-year-old girl, you don't want your dad to see intimate images of you, whether you
Right.
consented at the time to take them or not. And traffickers know that. They're expert at manipulation. And so that becomes like this digital leverage. So we
Yeah.
need laws to change in terms of criminalizing legislation, having legislation that criminalizes taking those photos of a child or an adult and distributing them, using them as threats. And right now, there's a piece of legislation called Take It Down that Senators Ted Cruz and Amy Klobuchar have put forth that would require criminal standards for individuals who do that. And I think that's going to take a big hit on traffickers as well. There's definitely a relationship. And I'm so honored that I was able to write this book and share Tiffany's journey, because I'm really hoping people who listen, people who read the book, start to ask themselves deeper questions about what
Yeah.
they can do to help and what their relationship is to this issue.
Yeah. Well, and also when you hear someone else's story, it helps you rethink the whole, like, kind of gives you a whole new perspective on what is trafficking versus what is prostitution. Let's get into that. What is the difference between, so you've got a lot of advocates here in this country, and I'm not sure where I fall on this one yet, only because I have been involved as an advocate for against sex trafficking, that I don't, many of my peers are pro legalizing prostitution. And I don't know I don't know how I feel about that, just because I know the nuances. Once you're involved in the advocacy work, you get a little bit more insight into how this stuff works, and you think this might just enable more than it would actually dismantle. There's like a possibility it could go in that direction. And then we can't really help these girls and boys. It's men, girls and boys who are being trafficked. Um, but some say no, legalizing would actually solve the problem, because then you could maybe eliminate the pimp or something, the trafficker. I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? What is the difference, first of all, and
So
what do you think
first
would it be beneficial?
So prostitution, by definition, is consenting adults engaging in a commercial sex act. So no one
Yeah.
in that scenario is not consenting. And you have to put a caveat around commercial and economic coercion, because there's that group of individuals who are like Tiffany, very much sex trafficked. There was no option of getting out. And then that's one group. The other group are these very consenting adult individuals who are engaging in prostitution. And then there's this very big group of individuals who don't want to engage in sex work, but don't know how else to survive and
Hmm.
feel trapped. And that's a very large group. Though that group is also very vulnerable to actually being trafficked,
Right.
because they are desperate, and traffickers know that. They know how to work the city, or online, or however they're going to do it. So sex trafficking, when you're talking about a child, is purely sex trafficking if there's a commercial component to the sex, no matter what. That's a national law and predominantly a state law. That said, there's also, for adults, you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So
Hmm.
that can be the threats of the photos, that can be a false job offer, that can be a false promise of marriage and love, and it can also be physical threats. In Tiffany's case, she was a minor, but she was stabbed in the leg. That's force. She
Hmm.
was told she was taken care of and loved. That's fraud. She was threatened to have her grandmother's house burned down. That was coercion.
Yeah.
So there's all of those elements that kind of commingle in getting into how legalizing the sex trade may or may not positively impact addressing trafficking. I think it's really in the devil's in the details. Is that going to be combined with supportive services, or law enforcement going to be cooperative, respectful, and making sure that individuals who do want out are able to get out? Are we going to have strong penalties for trafficking itself? And there's a whole myriad, I think, of things that have to happen. And so I would ask a city or a state how you're going to do this in the safest way possible, because it can't be just here, it's legal, best of luck to all of you. Because I think that creates a very dangerous dynamic. So I know that it's nice for a media interview to be like yay or nay, but it's really much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And by the definition of who I am and what I do, I've worked with trafficking victims, and I know that they need everything. When I ran my safe house and donors would ask me, what do we need to help survivors? I'm like, everything, from clothes to finding a job to counsel, everything, because the trafficker takes everything away so they can control their victim.
Yeah. I'm really torn on it, on the legalization issue because, like you said, it's nuanced. It's not as, you can't just say yes or no, and yes, it will hurt, or yes or no, it will help, or, you can't, there's so many different layers to that. But all in all, I mean, I tend to stay on the side of keep it illegal so that you can go after. But then I don't want the girls to be, or the boys, whoever's being trafficked, to then be thrown in prison like Tiffany for 10 to 30 years is what they were trying to get her for. I mean, that to me is just so terribly wrong. But even just on the surface, when I think about it ethically and morally, I just think I don't know of anybody who's in a who people that choose that line of work. And I know it's like the longest, it's the oldest, as they say, it's the oldest, what do they call it? The oldest occupation. I don't think I believe that, but they say this is the oldest occupation. And it's like preying on a person's, most of the people that unfortunately like go into that either have been coerced into it, feel like they have no other option, like you said, or, they're playing out their abuse from childhood over, basically they're allowing somebody to pay for them to relive that abuse over and over and over again in their adulthood. It's just, to me, such a terrible situation, no matter how you slice it. Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.